Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending tonight's talk. Breaking news, how bots, trolls, and other media manipulators threaten our politics. Before I begin, our organizing group would like to acknowledge that we are on traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg people, and that we want to respect and thank them for this opportunity. Today's panel is the outcome of a workshop that I've had the privilege of being part of with the co-organizers Chris Tenove and Heidi Dubois, both of which we were talking through around issues about disinformation and threatening speech online. So this is an important conversation that's taking place in many ways, dealing with the 2018 election in Ontario and the 2019 election happening next year. So there's pressing concerns that Chris will address. My responsibility is really here to give you some logistical details. If you're going to be tweeting, and we encourage that, if you could use the hashtag SMSRisks, that would be great, because that's where we're going to be trying to coordinate the conversation. I'd like to also thank our sponsors tonight. I myself am from Concordia University, and I'd like to thank the university for helping out with this event, as well as the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the University of British Columbia, the University of Ottawa, and last but not least, the Public Policy Forum, particularly Megan Diaz, Carolyn Dumont, and Jonathan Perron-Claude, who have been very fantastic in making this such a seamless event, so thank you so much for this opportunity. So I would like to pass the mic over to the moderator. Chris Tenove is a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. He holds a degree in political science from the University of British Columbia, and he is the author of the recently published Digital Threats to Democratic Elections, How Foreign Actors Use Digital Techniques to Undermine Democracy. I'd also like to add that Chris is a broadcaster whose work has appeared on Ideas in This American Life, and as someone who's had the opportunity of working with him in a small part to organize this panel, it's a tremendous pleasure to see all the competent thought and all the kind of insights that he's been able to bring today. So it's a real pleasure to be able to congratulate him, thank you, and to welcome him for what I think is going to be a fantastic panel. So with that,
thank you. Well, thank you very much. That was very nice. And I would like to point out this was Fenwick McKelvey from Concordia University. On your program, it had Ed Greenspan introducing this, but he was unable to come tonight. So thank you very much, Fenwick. I had planned, this being a university, to get these guys to write extremely dense PowerPoint slides and then give long talks, but we thought we'd try something a little different and have this more conversational. So just imagine the lights dimmer and us on comfortable armchairs and able to sort of discuss that way. And what I'd like to do is just quickly get into hearing their thoughts about these things, but through a few questions I'll ask each individually. And would like to start with Elizabeth Dubois, who I'm sure is famous here on campus, but for those who don't know, she is a faculty member in the Department of Communication. She's a go-to expert for anyone who is trying to understand bots and other forms of digital manipulation in Canadian politics. She studies digital media and its use for political purposes and also for its impact on the development of public opinion, including a recent and important piece called "The Echo Chamber is Overstated." So let's jump right in here, Elizabeth. Can you help us first just set out what bots and some of these other techniques are, so we're clear on that, and then maybe give a few examples about how you've seen them being used in Canadian or Ontario politics?
Yeah, well, normally I'd have a great slide deck for this, but I'll try my best without the slides. So first thing, I'd like to talk a little bit about the difference between bots and trolls and other kinds of media manipulation, because we're starting to use those terms all to mean the same thing and completely different things, even in the same conversation. That's a little problematic. So when I'm talking about bots, I'm talking about automated social media accounts or other kinds of accounts that you could find in other places on the internet. Somebody has created an account by using a piece of code. They've written a program, and they have found a way to make that account automatically post or like or retweet or follow or friend or whatever it is appropriate for the particular platform we're talking about. And these bots, being created by a person, are then kind of let loose given a set of rules that their creator has made them follow. Right now, most of our bots are dumb bots. They follow rules very specifically. There are experiments going on to create smarter bots, which use artificial intelligence to try and make those bots that can learn and create new rules for themselves as they interact in the world. But for the most part, we're dealing with pretty dumb bots right now. Then we have trolls. Trolls are actual humans who are typing out those messages, who are clicking follow or favorite or like or whatever button is appropriate. We think of them as actual humans who maybe are not necessarily contributing to public discourse the way we would ideally see in a nice participatory democracy utopia, but they're still actual humans who, if they are Canadian in a Canadian context, have a legitimate right to participate in their democracy and share their political opinions and their political ideas, even if they are unsavory, provided it's not hate speech or some other form of speech that we have decided is not okay. It's also not okay to tell people to go to the wrong polling station or to tell them their vote's not worth it, they shouldn't bother voting. That's voter suppression. We have laws against it. Then we have activism campaigns. And these campaigns could be run by political parties or candidates. They could be run by third parties. And so third parties in Canada in the election context are basically political actors, organizations that aren't registered political parties, but are still pushing some sort of political message, right? And so these groups can try and mobilize citizens, and they can do that in a genuine, organic way. We often talk about grassroots activism, and so you can imagine something like a mail merge campaign where you are trying to get your candidate to really support your view on the pipelines, and so you create a mail merge campaign where you get people to click and say, yep, I agree with this, and then all of a sudden a bunch of emails go to that candidate. We can also see that happen on Twitter or on Facebook or on instant messaging apps where a bit of technology is used to automate that process. And then we have astroturfing, which is when we try and create the image of a nice grassroots, green grass kind of campaign that's actually just been fabricated by some political staffers or a core group of volunteers who are maybe creating 5 or 7 accounts each on Twitter to send out messages to make it look like there's a ton of support for their candidate or a ton of people who really hate their opponent. And that kind of tactic also can start modifying the version of public opinion that the media gets to report, the version of public opinion that our fellow citizens see. So in each of these contexts, bots, trolls, grassroots activism campaigns, and astroturfing, the goal is to make it seem like some idea or some person is really popular and wonderful, or that their opponent is really horrible and the worst and shouldn't be voted for.
So that's very helpful. Now, what do those look like in the Canadian context?
So in the Canadian context, we have some examples of political bots which do some pretty useful political work. So we have examples of transparency bots, for example. WikiEdits is my favorite. It makes a tweet every time somebody anonymously edits a Wikipedia page from within a Government of Canada IP address. It makes information a bit more available. It's not always great, but it can be really useful, right? We also have some examples of amplifier bots. Some of my students in a class this past semester found out that there was a bot account in the 2015 election that was really pushing GMO legislation. And this bot just kept pushing out the same tweets talking about GMOs over and over and over again, particularly during debates. Lots of these tweets were coming out. Now, that didn't necessarily have an impact on whether or not GMOs became more or less regulated, but it was a bot that was active in the conversation. Anybody on Twitter following that election would have been able to see this kind of content and think, oh, hey, GMOs must be a major issue in this election, when I think anybody who was paying attention to the last election would probably say, in the grand scheme of things, GMOs was not a major issue. In more recent examples, there's been the Crooked Christine hashtag, which became vaguely popular. Popular is probably overstating what it was during the PC leadership race in Ontario. And it was created by 4 or 5 accounts that all seem to have been created at the same time, within a few minutes of each other. They were all posting the same kind of content, using the same kind of language, basically saying, don't vote for Christine Elliott, vote Ford Nation. Ford Nation is the best. It wasn't hugely successful, but it was an attempt at what could either be astroturfing or bot use, or most likely some combination of those things.
Right. Those are examples on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Do you want to tell us either something about similar techniques on other platforms, or how Twitter, which is consumed, political Twitter has a small audience,
pretty
maybe
niche.
An influential one, but a small one. How messaging to that audience might be breaking the news in some way or another?
Yeah, certainly. So it's important to recognize that a lot of the time when we learn about bots and trolls, we end up defaulting to talking about Twitter, because Twitter makes its data more available than other platforms do. It's a lot harder to track bots on Facebook, for example, even though Facebook is used by far more Canadians than Twitter is. That said, the people who do use Twitter tend to be pretty influential when it comes to setting the agenda for what we need to care about during an election. I'm talking about journalists. Journalists use Twitter to share their stories and to talk to each other about stories and to find new leads for new stories. Journalists create content that is the main way the majority of Canadians actually interact with anything from Twitter. And so when a journalist chooses to write a story because they've seen a lot of Rob Ford is the worst kind of content, or Doug Ford is the worst kind of content, both of those things are coming up a lot recently, right? Go vote in a few weeks. They see this content, oh, there's a lot of people still talking about his brother, he's running now, maybe I should write another story about it, I should talk about how much people are really anxious about this potential premier. And then they write that story, and it maybe mentions Twitter, or it maybe doesn't mention Twitter at all. And then the people who read that story have no idea it came from Twitter, are steps removed from the idea of that story might have been completely pushed to the fore because there were a bunch of trolls or a bunch of bots who were actively trying to push that particular story forward, actively trying to grab the attention of journalists and focus them in on one particular thing rather than the rest of the issues in an election campaign or the other candidates or what else might be going on. And so that's the kind of media manipulation that we as citizens, if we're not Twitter users, still might be impacted by.
Right. Thank you. That's I don't know if this is a Canadian inferiority or superiority complex, but the kind of techniques that you have studied have been picked up in pretty low numbers, and I know in your work you've commented on them as not being particularly successful.
Yes.
So let's hear about the big leagues of digital media manipulation, which is, of course, the United States. And we've got David Salvo to help us understand that. He's a fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is a project with the Washington, D.C.-based German Marshall Fund for the United States. David was also a Foreign Service officer previously with the U.S. State Department. And at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, you've been doing a lot of work, in particular on Russian manipulation of American politics. So do you want to just tell us some of the interesting stuff we've done there? Has that happened?
There's a lot to say. I'll try to keep it short because I could fill up the whole hour talking about this. Let me start with a misconception. So there's a misconception, including among many of my fellow countrymen and women, that Russian interference in the United States electoral process elected Donald Trump president or created the conditions for him to get elected. That's a fundamental misconception both of American politics and of how the Russians approach interfering in democratic countries. And I'll tell you why. So, shouldn't surprise anyone to hear that the United States is a very divided country. Politically, even racially, socially, still. So there are wedge issues out there that still inflame passions on both sides of the political spectrum. And that debate rages online across numerous social media platforms among legitimate participants in the political process, as Elizabeth said. So here's where the Russians step in. The Russians didn't create that division among Americans, but what they do is they exploit it and they amplify it. Here's how. It's how what I call the laundering of information or Russian narratives. So the Russians will put out narratives about the demise of America or how American is not yet like a post-racial, post-classist society. There are all these political divisions. They'll put that out through their official news channels. Or two ways out. Either they put it out through official news channels and that gets picked up by fringe left, fringe right social media accounts in the United States. And from there, the momentum snowballs. Or Russian bots, illegitimate bots, there are legitimate bots, as Elizabeth definitely outlined, but illegitimate bot accounts, or as you may have read from our special counsel, Robert Mueller's indictment, Russians masquerading as Americans on Facebook and Twitter end up gathering these genuine followings and pushing out these bunk narratives. Or well, they're not bunk, they're legit narratives, but they're not Americans. They're masquerading as Americans and amplifying that message, making it seem like they're more powerful and more widespread than they actually are. So that's the danger of Russian disinformation operations or influence operations in electoral campaigns. It's not that they're necessarily trying to get one candidate or one political party elected, although obviously as the election got closer to the finish point, it was clear that they were at least trying to undermine Hillary Clinton's campaign and get Donald Trump elected. But before Donald Trump was even on their radar, the Russians were all over social media pushing these fringe opinions on and amplifying racial hatreds and other sensitive issues in the United States. So that's the danger of Russian influence operations, and it's happened all across the transatlantic space. This isn't unique to the United States. This was happening in Europe way before it ever emerged on our radar. We originally thought this is just a problem for Russia's periphery, the Baltics, Ukraine, the Balkans, but slowly it started spreading westward throughout traditional old Europe, eventually made it into the United States. And they're operating in Canada too. It may not be as extreme of a case as it was in the United States, especially from 2015 to, well, honestly, to the present day. They're still waging these operations. They don't end with an election. They continue. But Canada is susceptible to that. You are not immune from these types of destabilization operations. And it's not just Russia who can wage them. Other state actors have these capabilities. Chinese and others have them as well. So that's a long-winded response maybe to your question, Chris.
Tell me if this sounds right to you. It seems to me striking that that Russian aims are to undermine the capacity for the United States to govern itself well. And I would imagine that most other state actors that want to have influence don't want a collapsed United States, but want to influence what the United States does and also not get caught. It strikes me that the Russian operations were not particularly well hidden. Do those sound right to you?
I think the Russians maybe, I don't know if they anticipated necessarily being outed to the extent they were on social media. I wouldn't be surprised if they expected to get caught on some of their cyber activities against electoral infrastructure. As you may know, the Russians probed 21 of our 50 states' electoral infrastructure, in not always sophisticated ways, making it pretty obvious that this is, our intelligence services were able to pick that up. But on social media, I'm not sure. I honestly think that they were so far ahead of the curve. We were playing catch up for so long that they might have thought that they could get away with it. But the Russians are playing from a defensive position. So they're a declining power, right? And there are both domestic and foreign policy reasons why the Russians wage these operations against not just the United States, but across the transatlantic space. So from a foreign policy perspective, if you think about realpolitik, the weaker your adversary, the stronger you are. So the Russians' aim was to distract the United States and Europe, for that matter, to have all this internal instability, be distracted by all these investigations, which is exactly what happened. The fact that we're still talking about what happened in 2016 today is already a victory for the United States. The fact that there's an investigation against a sitting president is a victory for Russia. Not a victory for the United States. Nobody quote me on that, please. And similarly with Europe, the Russians are trying to divide the United States and Canada from their European allies and partners. So this is all part of the great game of geopolitics that the Kremlin really thinks of the world in this way. And domestically, if you think about what President Putin and his regime is, it's an authoritarian, kleptocratic, corrupt regime. Its inherent enemy is democracy. It needs that external adversary to justify to his own people that you really want to be like the democratic West. They can't even hold an election without everyone going crazy and wondering if the result is legitimate. Do you really want that? No. Just keep me in office and wages will be stable and don't worry about political repression and all that. So there's a domestic policy component to what the Russians are doing in our society, in our governments as well. So
right, great, thank you. I'd like to turn to Brittan. We've been talking about sort of the geopolitical aspect, the gains that political actors can pursue and have, but often there are actual human beings on the other side of these messages, including ones that are amplifying hateful or antagonistic messages. So I'd like to talk to you about that, but first I want to introduce Brittan Heller is the director of the Center for Technology and Society at the Anti-Defamation League in the US. She's based in California. And the ADL is working, and especially your center, is working on a range of initiatives to deal with online hate and stigma. And before that, she was a prosecutor with the US Department of Justice, where she worked on war crimes and genocide and other important issue areas. And before that, Brittan had a series of personal encounters with some of the sort of unpleasant uses of
unsavory elements.
Yeah. So before we get back to your sort of more think tank self, I'd like to hear a little bit more just about what that was and what insights that gave you into being targeted for some of these techniques.
Sure. So in the U.S., law school is a graduate degree. So when I was applying to law school, I found myself targeted by a website that was supposed to be about law school admission, but really wasn't. And this was before Twitter, which was a blessing. So on the chat forum, people started talking and saying all of these ridiculous and harmful things about me. I wasn't a user of the forum, so somebody else alerted me to it, and I tried to ignore it for about 2.5 years until it started to have an impact on my real life. The postings started to get more violent. People started doxing me. If you're not familiar with that term, that's taking publicly available information about you that you can glean from online sources and putting up your social security number, your address, your class schedule, what you're wearing, where you live, what your parents' occupations are, your phone number, your address, and entreaties to people to do something with that information. So the people who ran the website also, they also started a Girls of the Top 10 Law Schools contest. I was attending Yale Law School at the time, and the organizers of the website were angry with me, so I was not on pornographic pictures, but my face was pasted onto crime scene photos. So I went back to the website and said, you really have to help me here. I really want you to take this stuff down because it's having an impact on my ability to get jobs at law firms. They're telling me it doesn't matter whether or not this is ridiculous and untrue. I mean, it's having an impact on my real life because these law firms don't want to hire me because their clients will see this. And the people at the website said, well, you'll have to sue us. And I said, okay. In the United States, there's a law called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And this means that people who run websites are not seen as liable for the content on that. You have to go after the individual posters of that content. So the suit was designed to see if under that legal construction, an average person could get redress for the things that were happening to them. The answer immediately was no, because we announced the suit on the front page of the Washington Post. And I'd gathered pro bono counsel from Stanford and from Yale Law School. And we really went on the offensive, and people thought that the case was going to go to the US Supreme Court. It got worse before it got better. People called me the girl who wanted to kill the internet. And so I ended up settling the lawsuit because I didn't want to create bad law. That law was designed to protect innovation, and I thought it was a good idea in some regards. I didn't appreciate the abusive aspects, and settling seemed like the best way to get rid of those. So we settled with the website. We helped them develop terms of service. We gave them lines of code so that the off-topic things would not show up on people's Google search and be attached to their identity. And I got to meet with all the people that we had been able to track who were posting these things about me. And I'd never met any of them. They lived all across the United States. They were men and women from professional backgrounds, to people with very minimal levels of education, a range of ages. And they all said the same thing. They said, I didn't anticipate that there was another person on the other side of the screen. It was just a game. I didn't realize what I was doing had this impact on your real life. I'm really sorry. And so the type of work that the Center for Technology and Society does now is we focus not just on hate speech, but on different social ways to deal with this problem. In this context, nobody is irredeemable. We just have to develop a better understanding as a society about why we have these type of issues and how to rehumanize people on the other side of the screen.
Thank you. So that was 10 to 15 years ago? Or
11 years ago.
11 years ago? Wow. I gave myself a nice wide boundary there to get. And so you mentioned, thankfully, Twitter wasn't what it is today, allowing the sort of real dissemination of those things. Do you want to just sketch for us a little bit of how you think this in the environment for online harassment or hate speech has changed? Because it feels like, as someone who reads about it in the news and elsewhere, that there's been this significant uptick in the last couple of years. And then you had also mentioned something to me about how the events in Charlottesville also were another sort of key point. So just to get a sense of how you see things changing.
Yeah, everybody looks at Twitter as a catalyzing force, and I think in effect it is. Part of the challenge of looking at online hate speech, particularly in the American context, is that there's no definition under American law of what hate speech is. So you're dealing with a very fluid animal. It's different when you look at things internationally, but the knowledge of what constitutes hateful content online is limited by a lack of data access as well. Twitter is unique in this way, and Elizabeth really emphasized this point where they offer their information publicly to researchers. So have a window into what Twitter looks like. We don't know what other platforms look like in the same way. But the best estimates that we can find is that there's I'd say between 3 to 4% of content on most social media platforms would qualify as hate speech, as a matter generally speaking. The people who produce hate speech produce this content in a pervasive way, but in a really concentrated way as well. So like in my suit, when we've done studies, we found that it's a very small number of people producing this, but because of the architecture of Twitter and the way that things pervade throughout the internet, they have an amplified impact. And this can be through bots, this can just be through people's dogged interest. And this can also be attributed to the permanence of the internet. When things show up online, it's very difficult to get the content down. The center that I run, the Center for Technology and Society, we're in Silicon Valley, so we do a lot of work with the tech companies themselves. I run a problem-solving lab with Microsoft, Twitter, Facebook, and Google, and it's not just their policy people, it's also their engineers. So we work on technical solutions to cyber hate-related problems. Since the Charlottesville events in the United States, there's been a real change in the willingness of tech companies to look at this problem squarely. I like to think it was a Rubicon-like moment. With groups of international experts on hate speech, we used to say, if hate speech leads to real-world violence. But today, every conversation starts because hate speech leads to real-world violence. So people take that as the baseline rather than a supposition that you need to prove.
Thank you. And another window into how hate speech is being propagated is the online hate index, which you folks have been developing. So maybe you could just say a little bit about that.
Sure. The online hate index is a project that the Center for Technology and Society is doing in conjunction with UC Berkeley. And it is using machine learning and artificial intelligence to create definitions of hate speech from the perspective of targeted groups. So at this point, it's 85% effective as to whether or not a comment would be considered hateful by the target of that hateful speech. The reason we designed it that way is because we don't want tech companies to be the arbiters of what is or is not hate speech. But we want them to be responsive to user concerns. We want them to have that information. And for several reasons, that companies aren't really motivated to look at that directly themselves. But if we give them that information, then we can push them to be more responsive to their environments. When we were designing this, I like to think about the problem of hate speech online as being, is it the dog or is it the tail? Is the problem hate existing on the platforms as a destabilizing force, as a body that we need to grapple with? Or is hate itself like the tail? Is it a byproduct of societal hate itself? So which way does the causality flow? We don't know. So we're trying to look at hate speech online and study it with machine learning, because that sort of algorithm takes into account context, shaded meanings, shifting meanings, and the way that language changes. So artificial intelligence is the best way to help us understand that.
Right, and then as you mentioned, going forward, that will enable you to partner in some ways with the social media companies and others to help them better understand the problem that they are dealing with. And I mention that because Mike Anani, who is our last but not least speaker, has been focusing in some of his research on just how these partnerships might work. Mike is a professor at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California, but grew up in Ontario, so a local boy. And in fact, you were saying father worked next door for a while, so welcome home. So he's published widely. Pardon me?
Belleville.
Belleville. All right. I didn't know if there's. I'm not from Ontario. I don't know if there's some dynamic between Ottawa and Belleville. I should don't know what Belleville is.
It's being recorded. I got it.
Yeah. So Mike's published widely on app design, on changes to journalism, and on the networked press more broadly. I'll plug his book that's just come out this month. It's called Networked Press Freedom, Creating Infrastructures for a Public Right to Hear, which just came out with MIT Press. But yeah, I'd like to ask him about this partnerships that he studied in a report for the Tau Center. So can you tell us, actually, even before you get to those partnerships, let me ask you to paint a scene a little bit, because I've used this term, the network press, so the reason these partnerships were being explored between the social media companies and these fact-checking organizations was because compared to a couple decades ago in which the big journalism organizations were information gatekeepers and there was the journalistic professionalism, presumably informing how they're dealing with things like disinformation and threatening speech and so on. Now you're looking for, with different actors, trying to find different solutions. So maybe before we talk about those partnerships, how did we get here and where are we at in terms of this sort of organization of information flows?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And I kind of want to echo what a lot of the other people have been saying in terms of the how we got here problem, Elizabeth, especially in terms of sort of how news and journalism sort of circulates online and sort of feeds back on itself in that Twitter especially pattern that you were talking about. But yeah, this idea of the network press, I think, is something that grows out of this funny sort of entanglement of traditional news organizations that for a long time sort of had this borderline monopoly on the kinds of information that we got, when we got information, whether that information was vetted, and the standards of vetting, and the kinds of people that were chosen to be journalists, the kinds of people who were able and powerful enough to own news organizations. And for a long time, there was this sort of rather hermetically sealed sort of notion of what the press is, and that work happened within newsrooms. It happened at particular beats, particular places, right? There's a beat system that was organizing where it was. And through a lot of different kinds of factors, that beat system and all those sort of gatekeeping functions have become sort of fragmented and distributed in a way, and they're living other places now. So part of the challenge is to kind of think about if the press is a thing anymore, if it really is a thing, and if the press is kind of this institution and this set of practices by which we get to know each other, by which we decide to govern ourselves, by which we decide whether we want to hang together as a polity, as people who are willing to live with each other or not. That's been a core function of the press. So part of what has happened lately is that function of the press is living other places. It's no longer just in newsrooms. So that's what the network press sort of tries to say. What is all this adding up to, in a way? This is sort of adding up to a world in which we can't even necessarily hold accountable or see or trace the kinds of processes by which we get our news information. So with all that as kind of a background, I think that's where we've come from. And so people increasingly, it's true in Canada, it's true in the US, are increasingly getting their news not only from social media. Broadcast TV and local TV is still actually a really large, powerful feeder of news information. But increasingly it's living in social media platforms. It's living in sort of algorithmic systems that are beyond both the visibility but also the comprehension of a lot of people. I've talked with people at Google and Facebook, and when you talk to them about a broken algorithm of some kind, often they'll sort of say, yeah, that's kind of messed up. That's really, I don't know exactly how it works, and I'll try to figure it out, but there's no single person. This sort of notion of algorithmic transparency or data transparency, that there's a person in a room at a company somewhere who knows how it works and just isn't telling us. That's actually not true. It's just this sort of, as Brittan was saying as well, this sort of distributed, sort of almost probabilistic system where we can't even say necessarily at any given moment of time what Google is or what Facebook is or what Twitter is. Anyway, that's a long way of saying, so maybe I'll just I'll try to compress a little bit and say, a lot of this was sort of the perfect storm. So things like Charlottesville, things like the 2016 US presidential election are sort of coming at this moment, Cambridge Analytica more recently, coming at this moment where we say, hold on a second, we can't even necessarily hold this thing accountable. It's not just news organizations that are doing it. So one of the responses to it was Facebook particular, and this is the study you alluded to, Facebook in particular is saying, maybe we need to seek out some sources of legitimacy and sort of professionalism that we don't have in-house. We don't have it within our organization. So they created this partnership with fact-checking and news organizations They have the partnerships all around the world, as we've heard about from the International Fact-Checking Partnership, which is a group out of the Poynter Institute in the US and Florida. And the group that I looked at in particular was a fact-checking organization. It was 5 fact-checking and news organizations that were partnering with Facebook in the aftermath of the 2016 election to sort of say, how can we fix this? What can we do? How can we sort of prevent this kind of thing from happening again?
Yeah.
So that's a long-winded answer, but that's where that genesis of that partnership came from.
Right, and your part, you do this interesting and very helpful dissection of what these partners wanted from each other, and then once they've come together, what's key to their partnership, and who gets to decide key questions. So would you just sort of sketch that out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the one big thing is there's this little dance that's going on, right? So this is a sort of a gross simplification in a way, but Facebook wants legitimacy is one thing they want. They had a massive PR problem, to be a little crass about it, after the 2016 election. Massive PR problem, not necessarily sure where the data was telling them about it. They need to do some kind of intervention into this space. They've also, in talking with people in Silicon Valley especially, there is a bit of a, and maybe Brittan can say more about this as well, but almost a bit of a crisis of consciousness amongst some of the tech workers and tech employees of saying, for a long time, they were sort of steeped in this world of, innovation is good, and we're going to move fast and break things, and we're going to sort of, prioritize that kind of innovation. And there's a lot of employees who are starting to say, wait a second, did I work on something that actually is creating this kind of world? Is my work doing this? So there's sort of an internal cultural issue. And then fact-checking organizations are saying we need access to the scale of information that Facebook is providing. So if we care about the quality of information online, it's not good enough to only do our sort of slow, artisanal kind of fact-checking work that we've been doing traditionally. We need to figure out how to scale up. So that's the dance that's happening. But in doing so, they end up having to create algorithmic systems to do it. That's the scale problem sort of says to you, if you want to move fast and you want to do things at large scale, you need some computational aspect approach to it. So the main thing that they actually did was, so Facebook made this thing called the dashboard, which is the dashboard is this piece of software that certain fact-checking organizations have access to, a mixture of algorithmic processing and human labor within Facebook, and that's the special sauce that's sort of magical that they don't talk about, that it's hard to describe, comes up with a bunch of stories that are potentially false, are potentially misinformation, potentially disinformation. They put it into this dashboard. The fact checkers then get to look at that dashboard, and only they get to look at that dashboard, and they get to decide which of those stories is sort of worthy of their effort, matches their editorial interests, all that kind of stuff. They pick stories off those dashboards. They then go off and do their fact-checking work, the same work they were always doing, and they then append or sort of add back to those stories on this little dashboard and say, here's the fact check on the story. That goes back into the belly of the Facebook beast and sort of gets churned up with a mixture of algorithmic processes and human labor. And then those are the things that are then presented to people to say, if you see something on your news feed that's potentially false, pops up to you and says, hey, our network of fact checkers has vetted this or has something to say about it. But in doing that, there's a ton of problems, right? Of like, how does that algorithm work that's surfacing these potentially false news stories? Fact-checking organizations are saying it takes us on the order of like 24 hours to 36 hours-ish to like do a good fact check on something. It's a manual process, and it sort of is meant to be a manual process. That time scale is a massive mismatch with how things work online a lot of times, right? And then you got to feed it back into the system. You don't know how long that's going to take. It can be sort of 72, 96 hours before this fact check starts circulating. That's sort of ancient time. So there's a problem there. There's a problem of Facebook has publicly said they've given $100,000 US to fact-checking and news organizations to participate in this partnership. $100,000 is not actually, buys you maybe a person or a part of a person. When you start to add in, overhead costs, like Facebook has some big resources. Kicking 100K to a news organization is a little frustrating. It's it's sort of an underinvestment in the phenomenon. So you might say, well, maybe we need some more investment. I could go on, but those are sort of part of the problem. Actually, the last thing I'll mention actually is, and this was part of the work that's maybe of interest to people, academics and scholars, and also civil society groups trying to figure it out. It's an incredibly closed system. So I talked to people across the partnership. I've never publicly said who I've talked to. I've granted everybody anonymity in doing so, because this is a common tech Silicon Valley thing to do is, they make you sign an NDA. They make the fact-checking partners sign an non-disclosure agreement, which sort of says don't speak about what we're doing. So to get news professionals to talk to me about the work they're doing is very difficult because they need to basically break a non-disclosure agreement or try to talk to me under some rules. I gotta say, the thing I land on is to say, I think that's problematic go back to the concept of the network press, which is supposed to be kind of the conditions under which we're governing ourselves. If those conditions are not able to be scrutinized, not able to be looked at, not able to be talked about, that's not just an algorithmic black box. That's a societal black box. That's a problem for how we govern ourselves if people are working under non-disclosure agreements about how the press works.
Right. So does it work? Does the...
So I will say...
I mean, there was a lot of discussion of special sauce at Facebook. So yeah, how good is it?
So we don't know exactly, which is not a satisfying answer, I understand. Facebook itself released a stat that said 80% of the stories that make this through this fact-checking process, are circulated less on the network and on the partnership. The fact checkers I talked to specifically said, well, that's a nice stat. We can't verify it because Facebook won't give us the data to be able to verify it. As fact checkers, that's a big problem. If they can't fact check themselves, so they can't actually, so they were highly suspicious in telling me about these kinds of things. So anyway, the short answer is we're just not sure about how it works.
But it's certainly an interesting model when we're talking about how to deal with this in a couple ways. On the one hand, you have this move of the some of the professional judgment from newsrooms that are collapsing in size to this small number of organizations, third parties from Facebook with a set of practices and ethics and legitimacy that Facebook wants to bring in, and then greatly scale up by learning from how they are identifying disinformation, responding to it. So that's really interesting. And then on the other hand, we have this, and it's an interesting example of a partnership oriented towards dealing with the kinds of stuff we want to know. And then on the downside, there's this issue of determining impact, but there's also who calls the shots, figuring out why certain things are put forward. So this is sort of a big picture question, so take any angle at it you want. But how much can these sorts of partnerships by self-regulating social media companies be effective responses to this versus another model of dealing with social media governance that would be more like these are this is what's prohibited and there'll be takedowns for this, and what do you think of these two approaches?
I mean, one answer to say I think there's no silver bullet, there's no single right approach to this that's going to solve all the problems. I think the partnership model is actually a really fruitful one. I think though that and we're seeing it in sort of some other contexts too, but the challenge for these partnerships is to be accountable not only within themselves or to the most powerful member of a partnership, Facebook in this case, but to make a partnership publicly accountable. And what does public accountability mean to an organization like Facebook, which is, it doesn't have to necessarily be publicly accountable. And historically, what we've usually seen in media companies, which I would call Facebook, even though it often calls itself a technology company, I think it's fair to call it a media company, is to say they usually try to hold off on public regulation by doing self-regulation, right? So if you can make that move as much as possible and say, we're regulating ourselves, we don't need the state or government intervention regulation, we want to make sure that that's not sort of a fig leaf for real public accountability. So I think one thing regulators and sort of civil society groups can do is to say, we have standards of what we consider a publicly accountable media system. Let's articulate and pressure and use those standards to hold the partnership accountable, not only say that the existence of a partnership is a good step on its own. We have to ask detailed questions about, is the partnership doing what we want it to do? So I would more look externally and say, what's a standard of public accountability? Use that to hold the partnership accountable.
Great. I'd like to get audience questions in a minute. I'll ask one question to give you time to sort of formulate and identify where the microphone is in case you wish to go to it. So, but I just want to sort of build on what you were saying, Mike, and see what other panelists think about this same sort of issue about the kinds of media manipulation or techniques we've been talking about among the spectrum of solutions. One is this real emphasis on content moderation, often algorithmic, at the platforms as a way to deal with it versus what could be other types of solutions. So I'd just be curious to hear sort of what you think about that one and what are other key parts of the solution puzzle that we need to keep our minds on.
I think content moderation on its own is not a panacea. Last year, my center went to a conference, it's actually in Toronto this year, it's called RightsCon, and it's the largest tech and human rights conference in the world. And we brought together a former ISIS recruiter, and we put her in dialogue with a former member of the Westboro Baptist Church. And that's the party in the US, or that's a body in the US that produces signs that says God hates fags, and they're classified as a hate group. And I put them in front of an audience of about 1,000 technologists. And I had them talk about how both of them had similar experiences online, where it was polite, pervasive, and persistent engagement with people who did not agree with them that changed their minds and led them to change their lives. So the woman ran, her name is Megan Phelps-Roper, she ran social media for the Westboro Baptist Church. And so there's a great piece in The Atlantic about her, about how basically it was her engagement with people on Twitter that made her change her mind. And now she speaks for our center a lot, and her life's work, along with the ISIS recruiter, former ISIS recruiter, is using the same techniques to de-radicalize people as we're used to radicalize them. And so whenever I think about content moderation, I think about Megan in the back of my mind, because she always says, if this was just taken down, where would I be?
Let's go through David.
I approach that question from a paradigm of foreign interference. So I totally take Brittan's point. I agree with what she said. I guess my answer maybe addresses a different side of that issue. I think most Democrats and Republicans in the United States would actually agree that foreign sources of funding for political advertisements online should be disclosed. So there is, in fact, legislation that is in the United States Congress called the Honest Ads Act, and it, just like we regulate political advertisements on TV and radio and media, so too would we then mandate that sources of funding for political advertisements online are disclosed, so that the Russians can't spend, a little bit of money, masquerade as Americans, and have it reach 100 million of our citizens. That I think should be regulated, and I think Canada should do the same. And if I'm not mistaken, I think there's companion legislation in the Canadian Parliament addressing that very issue. If there's not, there should be, but I think there is. So that type of speech, or that type of content, I should say, should be regulated. But we obviously have.
And
yeah,
to connect the wavelength, we're both talking about meaningful political discourse.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the Canadian context, there's the Election Act is being reformed right now. There's a new bill that's been put forward in front of Parliament, and there are provisions in it to basically eliminate foreign spending entirely on advertisements. There used to be a relatively low bar for how much they were allowed to spend, and now it's almost completely zero. And so foreign spending on advertisements is just no longer going to be allowed. And Mike Powell, who I don't know if he was able to come tonight, but he's a professor in the law department and has done a lot of work on this. I would encourage you to go look up his work if you're interested in the electoral law side of this. But to I'd like to go back to your question about content moderation and sort of sketch out the different pieces that I envision being part of this. One is the humans moderating content, and whether those humans are employed by the social media platforms, or they're employed by government, or they're employed by some think tank or civil society group. I'm not sure where that necessarily belongs, but there are people who can do some of that work. And obviously in the case of fact checking, that's really helpful journalistic work that we need. But that can be helpful and useful without saying we don't need other things, right? And so things like building out social cohesion and a social understanding of why these things come about and how do we actually get to the root of this fundamentally social problem, that's really important. It's also really important that we don't just say, oh, well, it's a social thing, the technology side doesn't matter, because platforms design algorithms that either allow this content to gain steam and become the thing on everyone's newsfeed, or they create algorithms that don't respond to the kinds of triggers like the kind of huge, splashy information. If it isn't going to promote clickbait, people stop writing clickbait, right? And so algorithms that are designed by engineers at platforms, those play an important role and we can't ignore them. And then the last piece that I'd sort of add in is media literacy. We need citizens to understand how information is coming across their feeds and their screens. And I don't think that any one of these different tasks is up to the job of dealing with voter suppression or hate speech or any other form of potentially negative political discourse. But together, these pieces, I think, is what comes together to give us a strong democracy, a good public space for us to engage in political discourse.
Thank you. Well, I think that handles the issue. But if any questions remain, I'd love to hear them. Do we have any? Terrific. Do you want to, and maybe we'll get first two of you. And would you mind just giving us your name before the question so we know how to respond?
That's good, because that relates to the question. Chris Tenove, from Ottawa, again. The anonymity question, the question of people being able to be anonymous online. I mean, in the early years of Silicon Valley, it was like, nobody knows you're a dog, yay. And now we're kind of bumping our head on the fact that, you know, anonymity all the time isn't necessarily a good thing, or it's good in some contexts and not in others. So I don't know whether this is a particular question for any single one of the panelists, but how do you square accountability and, you know, what's good about anonymity in some contexts?
Thank you.
So the latest studies
Sorry, I'm just going to grab one more. Yeah.
So my name is Antonio Giambardino. I'm also here in Ottawa. I'm just thinking about the way that I normally engage with the political process, and I'm thinking back to the last presidential election. I used to check Nate Silver's 538 blog every other morning just to see what the odds of one person or the other winning, and I didn't hear any mention of sort of the exit poll system and that whole polling economy that we have in North America. And you know, I'm hearing these interesting anecdotes about the ways in which these anonymous bots can create this idea that there's a mass consensus, and then people write, hey, look, there's this mass consensus, when there in fact isn't any. And so I'm wondering if the whole system of exit polling and polling that we've been using for, you know, the better part of a century is sort of no longer able to keep up in this new algorithmic era, or if there's some way using these technologies that you've described to actually authentically engage what public opinion is, or if that's still even possible to do.
Thank you, Antonio. I'll leave it to you. Yeah.
So for the first one, studies about cyber harassment show that anonymous speech doesn't really have an impact. It was very surprising and counterintuitive, because everybody thought that if you didn't if you got to say, like, I am a pooch, people would be more likely to harass because it wouldn't be attached to their real name. Studies have shown that it's actually the social environment, whether or not it's attached to your real name or not, that is deterministic about whether or not harassment occurs. Because within these platforms and these online social spaces, you are subject to social censure within that little online universe. So I think it's really interesting. People think that because things are online, they do function differently. And in a way that is fundamentally true, but we're all still people. So these were studies that I think Jane Nathan Mathias out of MIT, who's now a postdoc at Princeton.
Yeah, the real name fallacy. The real name fallacy is a blog post that he wrote that does a really good summary of those studies.
And if you're looking for another specific global example, if you do research, you should look at the context of South Korea, which had a real name law. That meant that you had to input the equivalent of your social security number in, so all of your online speech was attributed to your real name. And 2 studies came out of that. One said this had a great impact on reducing online harassment, and the other said it had 0 impact on reducing online harassment.
I was going to, the second question, I would sort of echo what Brittan and Elizabeth had said too. So the second question, I think, about polling economy is actually a really important one. And there's a sort of a long history of journalists always being in these sort of uncomfortable positions of wanting to think that public opinion is a thing that exists separate from themselves, and that public opinion or publics are things that exist in the wild that you just sort of find, that you just, are sort of there. And it dates back to the early 1920s, 30s of this idea of journalists trying to be sort of social scientists in a way, or like they call it science envy, physics envy, where you want to like think that the thing you do is just like physicists. You go out into the world and you sample public opinion and it's separate from you. Sort of this distancing thing that journalists do to maintain objectivity. And there's a long history of them doing that, and I understand for good reason. But I think what we're seeing now is sort of, especially with something like Nate Silver's blog or the New York Times. I don't know if I still have nightmares about that dial on the New York Times, which is, anyway, loading that page and seeing the dial move in bad directions. But these are sort of instruments of objectivity that journalists try to use to sort of distance themselves from their own role in creating public opinion. And I think with the tightening of timelines, we start to see journalists need to sort of move outside of just purely a they call horse race coverage of elections, of saying, who's up, who's down, who's winning, who's not winning, things like that. And to actually more engage and say that actually part of what they're doing, and kind of relates back to what Elizabeth was saying in terms of social media coverage, where you think social media is the beat that you're covering, but then your coverage impacts the beat that you're covering. Journalists need to get better at sort of seeing themselves as part of this loop of public making, not as sort of separate, sort of scientists, although scientists don't do that either, really. But yeah, that sort of distancing is the thing that I think we need to challenge.
I just want to quickly go back to the question about the balance between anonymity and accountability. This isn't a very satisfying answer, but I think the tech companies, along with those of us on the outside who study these problems, are still trying to figure out how best to strike that balance. And I'll give you an example from my previous life as a US diplomat. I lived and worked in countries where anonymity was absolutely essential to protect political opposition figures, human rights activists, to protect their lives, literally their lives. So we are still sort of, who think about these issues are still wrestling with how do you find that balance between genuine anonymity, which is necessary to protect people's lives in legitimate circumstances, and the type of anonymity that's exploited by nefarious actors for any number of purposes, not only political.
Thank you. Let's grab a couple more questions.
So while the mic's making it over to the people with the questions, perhaps I can just hop in on the polling one briefly.
Sure.
So just to say that the idea of mass consensus and polling being broken because we can't keep up, I think is the wrong way to frame this issue. It's always been broken. We've never had one version of public opinion that journalists can report well and have no influence on. And I think that's a lot what Mike was saying. But I think the next piece of this is increasingly other forms of data beyond just asking people what they think are becoming our way of measuring public opinion. We use social media data. We use other kinds of trace data when people navigate the internet to infer what they want or what they need or what they think or whether or not they're going to flip out over a new policy and if the politicians should just not go there. And thinking about the versions of public opinion that we create as being more than just when you've been asked what your opinion is, I think is really important as we move forward trying to understand the role of journalists in this environment.
Thank you. Great, yeah, if I could just get your name and hear your question. And also if there are any women in the audience who'd like to ask questions too, because we have been all men so far. But
Hello?
please.
Yeah, Andrew Romaine. have an MA from Ottawa U. But, 3 academics criticized media manipulation of events. Noam Chomsky comments how a genocide in East Timor, this is a long time ago, in the film Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky in the media, that's where I got that information. It was underreported, massively underreported by the New York Times. You can, there was another genocide happening in Cambodia that got miles of reporting in the New York Times. The East Timor massacre got, maybe very little. The other person who he was here recently at Ottawa U, Jeffrey Robinson, in his book, The Killing Season. I never heard of it. In 1965, 1966, there was 500, according to Mr. Robinson, 500,000 Indonesian communists were murdered by the government, and that was not reported by the media at all, any media, American, Canadian, or very little. And I never heard of it. 500,000 in 1965. In his 1917, the book, which I've read, I think he's Canadian, but he's now at UCLA, Jeffrey Robinson. The other person I'm going to mention, Bruce Cummings, his book, North Korea, Another Country. He's an American academic, 2004, North Korea, Another Country. And he said again that the New York Times reported on the, North Korea is a murderous, horrible dictatorship, whereas there was quite a lot of killing done by the Americans and the South Koreans. Again, a literal genocide. Again, I guess simply my question is there any difference really in this manipulation of the media? Of course, it's a technological, which I'm not very competent in, but is it simply a question of change? Because the manipulation of the media was always happening.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah. And anyone else who want to get for this one? Sure, yeah, please.
Sure. Or you can go first. I don't care.
All right. So my question is based on a number of personal experiences I've had with social media and interacting with social media. But I know this question is probably going to be more for Brittan because you work with the ADL. I've seen so much hate speech targeted towards, I'm Jewish, so targeted towards Jews, targeted towards other minorities. And I want to know your take, all of you, I guess, but like I said, especially Brittan, because that's what she does. How do you guys see that evolving? How have you guys seen that develop, and how is that part of everything we've been talking about so far? But yeah.
Thank you. Sure, folks, do you want to, we'll keep doing 2 at a time here, so, yeah.
Well, to the question about has anything actually changed? Hasn't this always existed? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, it has always existed. This is not new that people are going to try and manipulate the messages that are dominant in public discourse. This is not new that people would try and kind of wield information as a weapon for gaining power. That is something that has always existed and will always exist because we're humans. And that's how people in power work. What's new, I would say, is the scale and the speed at which this happens. There's also a new role that technology is playing in the decision-making that hasn't existed before. We've used technology to help us get messages out, the printing press, but the printing press itself didn't really make decisions about what was on the front page and what wasn't. A human did, and now algorithms are making decisions about that in ways that, as was already explained, we don't even always understand, right? And so that, I think, changes the context, because then we don't have one editor of a newspaper to go to when something is wrong or misleading. We can't go to the New York Times and say, why didn't you cover this, right? And so that, for me, is one of the major changes.
I would also add that nation states have been waging information warfare against one another too, since nation states have existed. So that also is not new, and my government's guilty of that too, and especially in the 20th century when the CIA really did not have a lot of legal and congressional oversight. I would argue, and believe me or not, we've had more of a national reckoning about that, but other countries, particular authoritarian regimes, don't have those sorts of checks and balances. And because of the technological revolution that we've experienced, especially since the internet age, but really in the last decade or so, there's a lot more rapid covert subterfuge, I would argue, that specific types of governments are waging against others. And I think that is new in a way that sort of information warfare, qua information warfare, is not.
Yeah.
So regarding online hate, but in particular anti-Semitism, my colleagues just came out with a report that tracked 4.2 million anti-Semitic tweets on Twitter for 2016 to 2017. We had an earlier report that tracked 2.6 million anti-Semitic tweets directed at journalists during the presidential election in the US. Looking at with the AI work that we've been doing, we found some very interesting results. We found that we expected to find that when people produced hate speech, it was born of personal animus, and so it would be very targeted and directed. What we found was that when people produced one type of hate speech, they produced it all, so we couldn't disaggregate it. We are now re-looking at that through the lens of foreign influence to see if we may have to revise our findings a little bit. The presence of anti-Semitism is the lingua franca of hate speech. And so when people put that online, it's sort of testing the waters to see how far towards extremist views people are willing to accept. And this goes for very far right and very far left parts of the political spectrum. In looking at some of the foreign influence operations, we found that anti-Semitic imagery and language is actually being personally targeted to people based on their political biases. And we found that it applies both to the far right with white supremacy and to the very far left. And in that way, it was caged in the language of anti-globalization. But it was the same exact content, the same exact pictures being used and sent to people. Same exact pictures being sent to people, which made it pretty particularly frightening.
I might add one last, my notes on what's changed. I think another thing that's changed is that we've gone maybe somewhat from the manufacturing consent model to the manufacturing overload or manufacturing cynicism model, where you might get more likely to get reporting on massacres in East Timor now, but it would be paired perhaps with an information strategy to create other hyped events so that it just gets pushed down in the attention economy and doesn't get much attention, or the creation of cynicism and a kind of despair about knowing which information source to trust, rather than having a few elite sources that you trust or don't, but they're kind of the only ones in the game and have built up their own legitimacy in certain ways, so that there's this often cynicism that exists around, whether you can believe any particular report. And I think that's different, and not necessarily worse problem, but a somewhat different problem. Two more questions. Oh, there's so many hands now. Oh, you've already got someone. Great.
There are two women who've been waiting. So there's me, and then there's this one right here as well. There's some more. I had a question for Michael, and then one for Brittany as well. Michael, you were mentioning about the standard of public accountability that has to exist, for example, for the partnerships that you described between the IT companies and the fact checkers. Is there anything in the way of such a standard yet? And if there is, or if there needs to be, what would be its components? That's my first question.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
And for Brittany, my question is about the sustainability of the model that you recommend for actually trying to absorb, I guess, in a way, the hate, and to try and neutralize and actually to turn people who are haters. It seems so very labor intensive. We've had experiments with this hashtag settler collector in Canada, of trying to do that, have like people take on Indigenous kind of hating groups. And I've been dabbling it from time to time. It's just like, it has to be like a full-time enterprise. because people can't do it as volunteers in their spare time. It's so demoralizing. These people are like flypaper, these trolls. So how do you actually make that into a sustainable model? Those are my two questions.
Thank you. And Megan, you had one more picked out here.
Hi, my question is for Mike. So you mentioned the collaboration with fact checkers and Facebook, and what I wanted to know was the effectiveness of that in terms of salience of topics with people, because you set the Facebook dashboard picks the topics, and then a fact checker decides this is important or it fits my beat, whatever, or so, and then they do a fact check on that. But is there a way to measure the salience of that in terms of just because you pick it does not necessarily mean it's going to resonate with people, or that people are not looking at other kind of platforms or fake news? So what measures are being taken to account for that?
Right, thank you.
Do you want me to go? Okay, I'll go first and I'll take the second question first, if I could, while it's still fresh. It's a great point, and actually it gets to this thing that the fact checkers and news organizations I talked to were pretty clear. They actually said the choice to pick certain stories or not certain stories, and then also the choice of how to write the fact checks, how to phrase the fact, they saw that as an editorial choice. So that's an editorial move by those organizations where they say, we're going to pick the stories that we think have public import, that we think need to be fact checked. And some of the fact checking organizations did some kind of stories versus others. So a couple of the ones I talked to basically said, we don't do any entertainment misinformation that's out there. There's lots of stories that are super popular on social media, but there's so the one they use is an old story. What's that? Bad Boy? Oh, I don't know about that one. So one they said that they always keep coming up a lot is basically, I was on my way to a concert for Bob Dylan, and my car broke down, and Bob Dylan happened to drive by, and he offered me a ride. And Bob Dylan's amazing because he gave me a ride to the concert, and I got VIP passes, and I got to go backstage, and Bob Dylan's awesome. And basically, like, that story has been told about everybody, right? I mean, about lots of different people. Sometimes it's Bruce Springsteen, sometimes whatever. So there's a lot of fact-checking organizations that are like, I don't care if that circulates. Like, that's not where I'm going to put my energy. I don't care. But stuff about misinformation, like political sourcing, things that they would choose that. So they would actually, that's their judgment of salience, and that's their judgment of importance. That's their editorial prerogative. That's what it is. On the second question of sort of what's standing in the way of sort of this happening, I think a few things. I mean, one, I would say, I think this is a broader thing. There is an ideological thing that's sort of standing in the way here, which is to think about whether industries are able to come up with solutions to the problems that either they may have or they may have created, and whether solutions come internally from an institution or an industry, or whether they need to come from outside. I think from the time I spent in Silicon Valley and spent a lot of time there, there's sort of a perception that this is something tech people can solve for themselves. We don't need outside regulation. But I think another thing standing in the way is like political will, to actually invest some political will in some of these topics and push for it. But then the third is sort of this idea of operationalization of this problem of public accountability. I don't pretend to have the solutions of exactly what it looks like. I think it's a hard problem to say this is different media accountability, public accountability than thinking about radio or cable TV or broadcast television. This is a different beast, and it's going to have a lot of different moving parts to it, and we need both access to how platforms work, but also the data they have, but we also need sort of creative regulators and creative self-regulators to say, how can we design these solutions? And I don't think we're there yet on operationalizing.
So your question was about effective and scalable counterspeech. Some of the elements that make up the special sauce of counterspeech is you need to make sure that it comes from an authentic voice, because the people that you are targeting with your counterspeech can smell if it's coming from a government or a didactic source. One of the partners that we work with is the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and they do very creative work. So one of the projects they worked on was taking former extremists and putting their stories to rap music, actually getting rap artists in Lebanon to make an album. telling the story of somebody who was recruited, went through ISIS and then left. And it's really good. It's really catchy. It's really good. And it's also kind of subversive in a way because rap music in Lebanon has this kind of countercultural thing on its own. So it's very attractive to people, and it's gotten hundreds of thousands of downloads. They also worked on soap operas. They wrote soap opera scripts and made a web series about that, and that's also been seen by hundreds of thousands of people. So using different mechanisms of online media to reach people in a way that would not necessarily be possible with one-on-one interactions, and using that to build community and open up conversations. I've been trying to use new media in other ways. We're working on virtual reality-based projects to promote civil rights in the United States. And if you have a really good answer for that, I am hiring a civil rights technologist. Come talk to me.
Thank you. It is 7:30 now, which is technically the time we were going to end. We started a few minutes late, so I'm going to arbitrarily add 5 minutes on to the session here. But I would understand if anyone has a really firm deadline, no social sanction for having to go. If you wouldn't mind, if you have a question, let's have a whole bunch of them, because it's worth knowing what other people are thinking, even if we don't really have time to get to them. And then I'll let the internal algorithms of each of our panelists decide what they will prioritize to answer. So please wave your hand if you want to at least get your question up there.
Hi. I was going to ask, first of all, about where, this question is probably directed for Mr. Salvo, but any of you can jump in if you'd like, where we draw the line of how we regulate what kind of content from news organizations from foreign countries we can block or allow, or what, how does that play out? Because I know that Russia Today was forced to register as a foreign agent not long ago in the United States. But should we, in your opinion, be blocking information from other countries from circulating on the internet in our countries, which is a hard thing to do technologically, or should we allow it and sort of tell people, well, these are people with certain agendas, how should we go about that? And my second question is about hate speech and where we draw the line on hate speech. So how do we define what hate speech is and what hate speech should be banned? And yeah, that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rubina. You asked the same question that I was going to ask. Essentially, what does it mean? How far do you go? And what's acceptable? The idea that we are leaving this fact-checking to organizations, tech companies, and whatever, how do you empower people? How do you educate people themselves to know when to engage a troll, when not to engage a troll? Should there be an anti-troll campaign that goes on against these trolls? And if there is, well, there's a business opportunity right there.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Mine are super quick. What happens when somebody doesn't believe the fact check? And are we winning? Is what the fact checks reveal to be true? Is there which way is that consensus going? Are we winning or losing the truth battle right now?
It's an easy one. Okay.
Easy question, easy answers aren't.
Oh, you've got one person you just. Oh. Yeah, we're gonna have to. We've got about a minute to get the question, so as quick as you can. Thank you.
How would you differentiate between a troll and someone who passionately disagrees with you?
All right, nice one. Okay.
Thank you all for your comments. Brittan, I'm really curious to know how the algorithms you're using to measure the hate speech is being held open, accountable, and transparent, because how do we know they're not going to go out of control?
Thank you.
And I'm personally curious about the role that general internet culture has had to play in all of this. And so we know that things like astroturfing and all that stuff have taken place in the past, but for more benign ends, like sending Pitbull to a random Walmart in Alaska instead of what it is now. So I'm kind of curious as to what sort of shifts have taken place and what makes it different than it might have been in the past.
Right. Thanks. And I'm going to sort of, unfortunately, arbitrarily end those just so we can I'll give each of you sort of minute tops to pick what you want to deal with, and we'll give some unresolved questions so that we're not, so that we leave some to deal.
I'll be very quick.
Sure.
No, I don't think that we should block RT or Sputnik or other state-sponsored news organizations. We should call them out for what they are. They're foreign agents. They're putting out state-sponsored propaganda, and we should let people know that's what it is, and they can make their own informed choices. And I honestly believe that if the Russians didn't pour all these resources into bots and troll farms and other ways to amplify those narratives that RT and Sputnik pushed out, they would close down in countries like they've done in Scandinavia because there's no audience. Those ideas have been relegated to the fringes of the marketplace of ideas because they're nonsense. So that's what I think.
In our study, in our AI study, about 80% of people agreed with a baseline of what was and was not hate speech. We ended up using the definition from the Encyclopedia of Political Thought because that was as neutral as we could find and was sort of the gold standard in social science. When I look at hate speech, what separates hate speech from unpopular political opinion is the catalyzation of it. If it is advocating real-world violence, then it crosses the line, or if it is targeting people for immutable characteristics. But for accountability for AI work, totally on the same wavelength as you. I think it's highly necessary. We published our methodology. All of the data that we used was publicly available, and the algorithm is open source so that other people can replicate the study if they so wish. How do you engage a troll? You change the social environment. So you can actually practice this in real life at your dinner table on Sunday if your family is like mine. And so if somebody says things that you think are abusive or you don't agree with online, the best thing that you can do is just say, I don't agree with you. I don't understand why you'd say that. I don't find that funny. And most people will respond to that because they're afraid of social censure.
Those are all great questions. The one I will take on board is this question of, what happens if you don't believe the fact checker, or what, are we winning or losing? And I think, for me, I would echo something I think Dave said in sort of original comments, but I would like to see this framed as not an information transmission problem of whether there is true or untrue information floating around the world, but I think we found that especially with the last US president election, where there were all these sort of folk theories of why that election happened the way it was, and some people said, well, the information was bad, and other people sort of said, no, it was a problem of sexism and misogyny, and I think a lot of that is true, and there can be multiple reasons for one thing happening. But I would love to see this also framed as a cultural problem, as an issue of how, as Brittan was saying, the different kinds of social environments that we are creating or are being created for us, and the power to be able to influence and create social environments. So move it beyond sort of a question of where is information moving, who's making it, and seeing it as sort of a transmission kind of problem. It's a cultural problem. It's a social problem. It's a problem of how we choose to relate to each other.
So, troll versus passionately disagreeing with you. I think that in theory, the nice way of distinguishing is trolls are out to evoke an emotional response. They're there to get you riled up, and they're not there to passionately convince you of their view. But if you don't have the same view as somebody, it can feel an awful lot like you're being trolled. And so really, troll is a matter of perspective. And it's not super helpful for us, because then how do you distinguish between good or bad contributions to democratic discourse?
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for giving your Monday night to us, and especially thank you to the panelists for your thoughts.
Thank you.